I'm going to talk to you today about the particular technique the government, or rather politicians and bureaucrats, including politicians in robes on the Supreme Court, have been using to steal our power. Every drop of power the federal government has, it has at our expense. It's a zero-sum game. It always is. As between the citizen and the state, power is a zero-sum game. Now, we want the government to have power to monopolize violence between us, so that the government has the power to do things like prosecute crimes, real crimes, things that are forbidden in the Ten Commandments, all that stuff that God said should not be done by free men if they want to remain free. That's what the first commandment says. Do the following things if you want to remain free. I just brought you out of slavery. And God didn't forget anything. All those crimes that are in the Ten Commandments, those are the only real crimes. And what the message God was also giving is, if the state forbids more than that, then you're not free. And that's the situation we have now, where the federal government is constantly creating new crimes. In fact, real crimes were only supposed to be prosecuted by the states when the country was formed. Every one of the states had what's called the common law, and they had criminal laws forbidding things like fraud, murder, rape, theft, robbery, all the really bad stuff. And by the way, fraud is a business crime. It's part of the crime described, thou shalt not commit false witness. But all the states had business torts. They didn't need new law telling businesses how to operate so they wouldn't commit crimes. They didn't need environmental laws to keep businesses from making the land poisonous. We had public nuisance and private nuisance laws. That's part of the law of torts. But the federal government, particularly since the 1930s, has been creating all these new laws, criminalizing all sorts of additional conduct. In fact, they've been criminalizing practically everything ordinary business people do, so that it's impossible not to commit crimes somewhere. Because what they've done is they've created these regulatory agencies. Congress has been doing this. All these regulatory agencies that have passed hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations. Have you read them all? Of course not. And no one has. It's impossible to read them all. But did you know that under the federal government takes the position that if you violate any of those things, you've committed a crime? And all of that nonsense, criminalizing everything that's in those quote-unquote regulations. And by the way, they call them regulations because Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution says what's necessary for a law to be an actual law. If it doesn't qualify, then it's not a law. And none of those regulations qualify. They've all been created under procedures that Congress has dreamed up that have nothing to do with the Constitution. And Congress is not allowed to change the Constitution by itself. But that's what they've done. They passed what they called the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946, which they claim gives them the right to pass those regulations and give them the force of law, even though they don't qualify as laws under the Constitution. And all those regulatory agencies that they've created, they have been using one clause in the Constitution, one clause and one clause alone, to justify them. And bear in mind, the Constitution is a contract between the citizens and the states. It wasn't there when the Republic was first formed. It was formed years later, and they had to ratify it. It says the people, and it's got all these signatures at the end. It's a contract, and it's subject to the laws of contract, which predated the Constitution. The common law laws of contract govern the Constitution. How it's interpreted, how anyone's allowed to take advantage of it, all of that is subject to the laws of contract, and they wanted it that way. That's exactly why they made it a contract. But it does several things. It's also the supreme law of the land. It says that right in the Constitution. And what it also does, it creates the federal government in the Constitution. Federal government didn't exist at Yorktown when we defeated the British. It wasn't there. Why? When Washington surrendered, it was on behalf of a treaty on behalf of all the states that we accepted their surrender. But there was no federal government. It was created in the Constitution, and the Constitution specifies every power the federal government has, and the Ninth and 10th Amendments, which Jefferson demanded specifically for this purpose, specify that if any power is not specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution, it does not have it. It remains with the citizens or the states, but the federal government doesn't have it. And the federal government has been claiming, or rather the courts have been ratifying what the president and Congress have been doing, particularly since the 1930s. The real encroachment started under Theodore Roosevelt beginning in 1906. There was actually what it is, they create these federal agencies that are given policing powers over the citizens. That's what they do. They claim they're setting it up to benefit us. It's going to be for our health or safety. It's policing us. That's what they do. And the federal government was not supposed to be in the business of policing us at all. And I'm going to show you the text of a Supreme Court decision from the 19th century that recognizes that. Because there's one clause and one clause alone in the Constitution that they have been relying on as supposedly the constitutional basis for every single one of those agencies in Washington. Every one of them except the IRS, which is permitted because they ratified the 16th Amendment, which justifies having the IRS, although they've given the IRS way more power than the 16th Amendment permits. Anyway, the clause that permits all of this to exist, it's called the Interstate Commerce Clause. And I'm going to read you what it says. It's in Article 1, Section 8, and you can see it on the screen. It says, Congress shall have the power, quote, to regulate commerce. And by the way, at that time, commerce didn't mean exactly what it means today. It meant the word, what we call trade. So Congress shall have the power to regulate trade with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That's the clause. So it's just a little part of it that says among the several states. They claim because it says that they can regulate any commerce between anyone in the country if they have some rational basis for doing it. Now, just grammatically, it's obvious that that's crazy, because if that's true, if you look at it textually or grammatically, does anyone think that those words permit the federal government to regulate and police individual Indian tribes and foreign nations, or the citizens of foreign nations themselves? If you agree with the reading they've been giving it, that's what you have to believe, that it permits that. The regulation of foreign citizens by the federal government. It's obviously crazy. And yet that's the reading that the Supreme Court has been giving it since the mid-1930s. There was a decision in 1942 that basically said they could do anything. So that the Constitution, which was supposed to very strictly limit the powers of the federal government, they have turned into a document which gives it carte blanche to do anything. And that's the clause they're betting on as the source for that. Now, I'm also going to show you language from a Supreme Court decision by Chief Justice Marshall, who was one of the founders. He was the Chief Justice, and in 1824, he ruled on what that clause does. And I'm going to read you what it says. He said, this is in what's called the syllabus of the case. That's the official summary of what the case says. It's a very long opinion. It's hundreds of pages long. Anyway, what he says, state inspection laws, health laws, and laws for regulating the internal commerce of a state. And those, by the way, those are what citizen policing laws are. That those laws and those which respect to turnpike roads, ferries, etc., are not within the power granted to Congress in that clause. Full stop. They knew that none of these, that clause doesn't give them that power at all. And in fact, in Federalist 42, They say the reason why they passed that clause, it wasn't to regulate commerce, to regulate businesses. It wasn't to treat businesses like slaves that they could order around, which is what they've been doing ever since. It was to protect businesses who had dealings across state lines from other states. In other words, it was to protect a business that was based in Pennsylvania that was doing business in New Jersey from having New Jersey harm them. That's what that clause is for. It's in the Federalist 42, and I'll let you read the part of it and I'm showing you now exactly why this entire basis that they have been claiming gives the federal government all that power over us, everything. They can dictate all contracts. They use the clause for everything. They use this clause to justify environmental legislation. They use this clause to justify everything that all alphabet agencies do. And it doesn't justify any of it, according to the Supreme Court itself, under Chief Justice Marshall. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please follow me and tell your friends about me.